Today, we're diving into the 5 most dangerous wildlife threats that haunted Australian soldiers in Vietnam. These are the fears that veterans specifically requested to be covered. What you're about to hear isn't sanitized history. This is the raw, visceral reality of what made Vietnam such a biologically brutal conflict for the Australian troops who fought there. Some of this might be difficult to hear, but it's important that we understand what these men went through. If you're a veteran watching this, you already know these fears intimately. For everyone else, pay attention, because this is the side of war that rarely makes it into textbooks or movies. Let's get into it. The venomous snakes that lurked everywhere. The first and perhaps most pervasive wildlife threat we need to discuss is one that made every step through the Vietnamese jungle a calculated risk. Venomous snakes. Vietnam was home to over 200 species of snakes, with approximately 60 of them carrying venom capable of killing a human being. For Australian soldiers who spent their tours moving slowly and methodically through dense jungle terrain, these serpents represented a constant, invisible threat that could strike without warning. According to military medical records from the Vietnam War, between 25 and 50 soldiers were bitten by snakes annually during the conflict. While this might seem like a relatively small number when compared to combat casualties, the psychological impact of knowing that death could come from beneath your feet, from overhead branches, or from the dark corners of bunkers and latrines was immense. Australian troops, trained in the methodical jungle warfare tactics developed during the Malayan Emergency, moved through terrain where these creatures thrived. The bamboo pit viper earned a reputation among all troops in Vietnam that bordered on legendary terror. American soldiers called it the two-stepper, based on the belief that after being bitten, you could only walk 2 steps before death claimed you. While this was an exaggeration, the name stuck because it captured the genuine lethality of this snake's venom. Australian soldiers encountered these vipers constantly throughout their deployments in Phuoc Tuy province and beyond. The bamboo pit viper possessed several characteristics that made it particularly dangerous in combat conditions. First, its camouflage was nearly perfect. The snake's green coloration and pattern allowed it to blend seamlessly into the bamboo groves and jungle vegetation where Australian patrols moved. Veterans described the horror of grabbing bamboo stalks for support while moving through difficult terrain, only to realize too late that what they'd grabbed was not bamboo at all, but a living, venomous serpent. Second, these vipers were arboreal hunters, meaning they lived in trees and vegetation at various heights. Australian soldiers couldn't simply watch their feet. They had to maintain constant vigilance at eye level and above, scanning branches and vines for the telltale shape of a coiled snake. During night operations, when visibility was measured in feet rather than yards, this vigilance became nearly impossible to maintain effectively. The bamboo pit viper possessed heat-sensing organs between its eyes and nostrils, giving it what could be called thermal vision. This adaptation allowed the snake to strike with remarkable accuracy even in complete darkness, detecting the body heat of approaching soldiers. For Australian troops conducting night ambushes or moving through jungle in darkness, this meant the snake held every advantage. It could see them long before they could see it. The venom itself caused hemotoxic reactions, destroying blood cells and tissue. A bite resulted in immediate, intense pain at the site, followed by rapid swelling that could encompass an entire limb within hours. The tissue around the bite would begin to necrose, literally rotting while the victim still lived. Without immediate medical treatment, Including antivenin, the venom could cause kidney failure, massive internal bleeding, and death. For Australian soldiers on extended patrols deep in hostile territory, a bamboo pit viper bite represented a mission-ending emergency. The bitten soldier would need immediate evacuation, putting the entire patrol at risk. If extraction wasn't possible due to weather, enemy activity, or terrain constraints, the medic would have to treat the victim in the field with limited resources, knowing that every hour without proper medical care decreased the soldier's chances of survival. The Viet Cong understood the psychological power of these snakes and weaponized them whenever possible. In the extensive tunnel systems that honeycomb the Vietnamese countryside, communist forces would hang bamboo pit vipers from tunnel ceilings using simple contraptions. When Australian or American tunnel rats crawled through these confined spaces searching for enemy fighters or weapons caches, they would trigger mechanisms that dropped live snakes onto their heads and shoulders. Imagine the scenario. You're crawling through pitch darkness in a tunnel barely wide enough for your shoulders. The air is stale and oxygen depleted. You can't turn around. You can only move forward or backward. Your flashlight provides minimal illumination in the dust-filled air. Then something drops onto your neck from above. Something living. Something that immediately begins to coil and strike. The tunnel rat's nightmare wasn't just being shot by an enemy soldier waiting in the dark. It was having a two-stepper deposited directly onto exposed skin in a space too confined to effectively defend yourself. But the bamboo pit viper was far from the only venomous snake Australian troops had to fear. The king cobra, the world's longest venomous snake, inhabited the Vietnamese jungles in significant numbers during the war. These massive serpents could reach lengths of up to 19 feet, and when threatened, they could raise themselves up to 1/3 of their body length, bringing them eye to eye with a standing soldier. King cobras possessed several characteristics that made encounters with them particularly terrifying. First, their size meant they carried massive volumes of venom. A single bite could inject enough neurotoxic venom to kill a dozen men. The venom attacked the nervous system, causing progressive paralysis that would eventually reach the respiratory muscles, resulting in death by suffocation as the victim remained fully conscious, unable to draw breath. Second, king cobras were aggressive when threatened. Unlike many snake species that would retreat when given the opportunity, a threatened king cobra would stand its ground, spread its distinctive hood, and advance on the perceived threat while emitting a deep, rumbling growl unlike any sound made by other snake species. Australian soldiers describe encounters where king cobras actively pursued retreating troops, refusing to be intimidated by group size or noise. Third, king cobras possessed exceptional eyesight for a snake. They could track moving targets at considerable distances and strike with remarkable accuracy. For soldiers moving through jungle where visibility was limited, this meant that a king cobra might detect and track them long before they realized the snake was present. Troops found king cobras in every imaginable location. They appeared in rice paddies, where their dark coloration helped them blend into muddy water and vegetation. They were discovered coiled in the communal latrines at fire support bases drawn by the rodents that congregated there. Multiple veterans report the experience of sitting down on a helicopter seat only to discover a king cobra coiled beneath them, or finding one curled in their sleeping quarters, attracted by the warmth and shelter. One Australian door gunner reportedly kept a juvenile cobra as a mascot, storing it in a cooler under his cot. He named it O after the distinctive white marking on the back of its head. While this might seem like madness to those unfamiliar with the environment, it illustrates an important point about life in Vietnam. The presence of deadly creatures became so normalized that some soldiers developed a fatalistic acceptance of the danger, even going so far as to coexist with the very animals that might kill them. The Malayan crate represented another deadly threat. These snakes, with their distinctive black and white bands, possessed venom so potent that a single milligram could kill a 75-kilogram man. The neurotoxic venom caused progressive muscle paralysis, leading to respiratory failure. Without immediate treatment, mortality rates reached 60 to 70%. Krates were nocturnal hunters, meaning they were most active during the same hours when Australian forces conducted many of their operations. The snakes preferred to hunt near water sources and human settlements, exactly the areas where soldiers would establish patrol bases and conduct operations. Their nocturnal nature meant encounters typically occurred in darkness, when identification and defensive actions were most difficult. What made krates particularly dangerous was their behavior when encountered. Unlike more aggressive species, krates typically didn't strike with warning signs. They would remain motionless, relying on camouflage. A soldier might step over or near a crate without the snake reacting, but if touched or stepped on directly, the snake would strike without the defensive displays common to many other species. There would be no warning hiss, no coiling, just a sudden strike, an injection of lethal venom. Russell's vipers added another dimension to the snake threat. These heavy-bodied snakes possessed hemotoxic venom that caused massive tissue destruction and internal bleeding. The venom disrupted blood-clotting mechanisms throughout the body, causing the victim to hemorrhage from multiple sites simultaneously. Russell's vipers were responsible for thousands of snakebite deaths annually across Asia, making them statistically one of the most dangerous snakes in the region. The challenge for Australian soldiers was that snake identification in field conditions was nearly impossible. A glimpse of scales through jungle vegetation, a brief encounter in tall grass, or a nighttime confrontation in darkness didn't allow for careful species identification. Every snake had to be treated as potentially lethal because mistakes weren't survivable. The slow, methodical patrolling tactics that Australian forces employed actually increased their exposure to snake encounters in some ways. While the careful, quiet movement helped avoid human enemies, it meant Australian patrols spent more time in snake habitat than units that moved through areas quickly. A patrol that took 9 hours to cover 1 mile of terrain, as was common for Australian forces, had 9 hours of potential snake encounters in that same mile. Australian tactics emphasized moving off established trails, pushing through dense jungle where paths didn't exist. This was tactically sound, as it avoided ambushes and booby traps that the Viet Cong positioned along known routes. But it also meant moving through pristine snake habitat, through areas where the serpents hadn't learned to avoid human presence, through vegetation where every step could disturb a hidden viper. Medical treatment for snake bites in field conditions was limited and often ineffective. Medics carried general anti-venin when available, but proper treatment required identifying the specific species that had delivered the bite to administer the correct antivenin. In combat conditions, with a soldier in pain and shock, with the snake having disappeared into jungle vegetation, identification was usually impossible. The recommended field treatment evolved throughout the war, but generally involved immobilizing the affected limb, keeping the victim calm to slow venom circulation, and evacuating for proper medical care as quickly as possible. but evacuation from deep jungle positions could take hours or even days. Helicopters couldn't always reach remote patrol locations due to terrain or weather. Even when extraction was possible, the victim might endure hours of agony before reaching medical facilities with proper anti-venin supplies. Australian soldiers developed various coping mechanisms for the constant snake threat. Some troops would make noise while moving through dense vegetation, banging branches, or deliberately creating sound to encourage snakes to flee. But this tactic contradicted the silent movement necessary for effective ambush operations and could alert human enemies to their presence. Others developed obsessive checking behaviors, examining every surface before touching it, peering into every dark space before reaching inside, shaking out boots and clothing before putting them on. These behaviors became ingrained habits that many veterans report continuing decades after leaving Vietnam. The psychological weight of the snake threat, combined with all the other dangers, created a state of perpetual hypervigilance that took an immense toll. You couldn't relax. Every vine might be a snake. Every rustling in the undergrowth might be a cobra. The ground beneath your feet, the branches overhead, the darkness of night, all held potential death from creatures that killed not with bullets or explosives, but with venom that caused agony and systemic collapse. The microscopic killers, malaria and mosquito-borne disease. The second major wildlife threat Australian soldiers faced came from creatures barely visible to the naked eye: mosquitoes. These tiny insects carried diseases that incapacitated and killed more soldiers than many combat engagements. For Australian forces in Vietnam, the mosquito-borne illness of malaria represented one of the most serious non-combat threats they would face throughout their deployment. Malaria had plagued Australian military operations before. During World War II, falciparum malaria had stopped the Australian Army's advance in New Guinea in 1943 and 44, creating a medical crisis that threatened entire operations. Military medical leadership remembered these epidemics and understood the potential for malaria to destroy combat effectiveness as thoroughly as enemy action. When Australian forces deployed to Vietnam in the 1960s, they found an environment where malaria was endemic and growing worse. The strain of Plasmodium falciparum circulating in Southeast Asia had developed resistance to chloroquine, the primary anti-malarial drug that had been effective in previous conflicts. This drug resistance meant that the standard prevention protocols were failing, allowing breakthrough infections even in soldiers who rigorously followed medication schedules. In 1966, malaria rates among Australian troops in Vietnam reached crisis levels. The military medical establishment recognized that without effective prevention, malaria could reduce Australian combat effectiveness to the point where operations would have to be curtailed. The solution was to add dapsone to the existing proguanil prophylaxis regimen, creating a drug combination that proved effective against the resistant strains. However, the dapsone combination came with its own serious risks. A small number of soldiers who took the medication developed a granulocytosis, a potentially fatal condition where the bone marrow stops producing white blood cells, leaving the victim vulnerable to overwhelming infection. This created a terrible calculus for military medical officers. They could prevent malaria with a drug that might kill a small percentage of troops, or they could withhold the drug and allow malaria to incapacitate large percentages of units in the field. The military chose effectiveness over safety, but the decision was not taken lightly. According to military medical records, Only 2 Australian soldiers are documented to have died directly from malaria during the Vietnam War, a remarkably low number that speaks to the effectiveness of the prophylaxis program. But the human cost in terms of illness, incapacitation, and long-term health consequences was much higher than the death toll suggests. Understanding what malaria actually does to the human body helps illustrate why Australian forces treated it so seriously. Malaria is caused by Plasmodium parasites transmitted through the bite of infected Anopheles mosquitoes. When an infected mosquito bites a human, it injects the parasites into the bloodstream. These parasites travel to the liver where they multiply, then burst back into the bloodstream and invade red blood cells. Inside red blood cells, the parasites continue reproducing until the cells burst, releasing more parasites to infect more cells. This cycle of infection and cell destruction causes the characteristic symptoms of malaria: cyclical fevers that can reach dangerous levels, severe chills and sweating, intense headaches, muscle and joint pain, nausea and vomiting, and potentially fatal complications. Plasmodium falciparum, the dominant malaria species in Vietnam, was and remains the most deadly form of malaria. Unlike other malaria species, falciparum can progress to cerebral malaria, where infected blood cells accumulate in brain capillaries, causing seizures, coma, and death. It can also cause massive hemolysis, the destruction of red blood cells, leading to severe anemia and kidney failure. For Australian soldiers on patrol in remote jungle locations, malaria struck with terrifying speed. A soldier could wake up feeling fine, go on patrol, and by afternoon be burning with fever, delirious, and unable to walk. Veterans describe watching comrades transform from effective soldiers to barely conscious patients within hours. The tactical implications were severe. A soldier incapacitated by malaria became a burden on his entire unit. He couldn't carry his own equipment. He couldn't maintain security. He required constant monitoring and care from medics and fellow soldiers whose attention was diverted from the tactical situation. Most critically, he required evacuation, which meant calling in helicopters, establishing landing zones, and conducting operations that exposed the entire unit to enemy observation and attack. Australian forces operated with smaller unit sizes than their American allies, making the loss of even one man to illness more impactful. In a section of 8 to 10 men, losing one soldier to malaria meant a 10% reduction in combat power. In remote patrol situations where Australian Special Air Service teams operated with only 4 to 6 men, a single malaria case could compromise the entire mission. The mosquitoes themselves were inescapable. Anopheles mosquitoes bred in the rice paddies, swamps, and stagnant water that dotted the Vietnamese countryside. They emerged in clouds at dusk and remained active through the night, exactly when Australian forces conducted many of their operations. Veterans describe being covered in hundreds of mosquitoes simultaneously, the constant high-pitched whining, the welts from countless bites. Standard military insect repellent provided minimal protection. The DEUT-based repellents would sweat off within hours in Vietnam's heat and humidity, leaving soldiers defenseless. Reapplying repellent required time and created distinctive odors that could compromise tactical operations. Some soldiers forewent repellent entirely during ambush operations, accepting the mosquito bites rather than risk enemy detection. The malaria prophylaxis regimen added another layer of difficulty to soldiers' lives. Taking the medications was not optional, it was a command responsibility. Unit leaders were required to directly observe soldiers taking their weekly anti-malarial pills, often during mess line formations where each man had to swallow the medication while being watched. But the medications themselves caused problems. Soldiers taking the dapsone and proguanil combination often experienced side effects, including nausea, headaches, and gastrointestinal distress. The dapsone caused methemoglobinemia in many users, a condition where hemoglobin loses its ability to carry oxygen effectively. Soldiers with elevated methemoglobin levels would become short of breath during physical exertion, experience dizziness and fatigue, and show a characteristic bluish discoloration of the skin and mucous membranes. Some soldiers, feeling sick from the preventive medication and believing themselves to be safe because they were taking it, would skip doses or dispose of pills rather than swallow them. This created breakthrough infections that sometimes proved more severe than infections in soldiers who had never taken prophylaxis, possibly due to the partial drug resistance developed by parasites exposed to subtherapeutic drug levels. The Australian military medical establishment took malaria control very seriously, viewing it as a command responsibility rather than an individual health issue. This culture came directly from the World War II experience, where malaria had devastated Australian forces in the Pacific. Commanders whose units showed elevated malaria rates faced professional consequences, creating strong incentives to enforce prophylaxis compliance. Despite these efforts, malaria remained a constant threat throughout Australian operations in Vietnam. The high prevalence of the disease in the local population meant that the mosquito vector was always present and always infected. Vietnamese civilians living in villages near Australian bases served as disease reservoirs, maintaining the parasite in the local mosquito population even as Australian troops took prophylaxis. Dengue fever added another mosquito-borne threat that Australian soldiers faced. Unlike malaria, dengue had no preventive medication and no effective treatment. Soldiers who contracted dengue, called break-bone fever for the intense joint and muscle pain it caused, could only wait for their immune systems to overcome the infection while managing symptoms. Dengue infections caused high fevers, severe headaches behind the eyes, joint and muscle pain so intense that movement became difficult, and skin rashes. In severe cases, dengue could progress to dengue hemorrhagic fever, where blood vessels began to leak, causing internal bleeding, shock, and potentially death. But even uncomplicated dengue was completely debilitating, rendering soldiers unable to perform any duties for days to weeks. Japanese encephalitis represented another mosquito-borne threat, though less common than malaria or dengue. This viral infection could cause inflammation of the brain, leading to seizures, permanent neurological damage, and death. While rare, the severity of Japanese encephalitis made it a feared disease among military medical personnel. The cumulative impact of mosquito-borne diseases went beyond the immediate illness. Soldiers who survived severe malaria often developed chronic health problems. The falciparum malaria strain could remain dormant in the body, causing recurrent infections months or even years after the initial exposure. Some veterans report experiencing periodic malaria relapses decades after leaving Vietnam, their bodies still harboring parasites from wartime infections. More insidiously, some research suggests that cerebral malaria may cause long-term cognitive impairment even in survivors who seem to make full recoveries. Studies of Vietnam veterans who suffered cerebral malaria showed lower cognitive test scores and higher rates of psychiatric problems years after infection, suggesting that the brain damage caused by infected blood cells blocking brain capillaries might start progressive neurological decline. The mosquito threat also interacted with other dangers in complex ways. Soldiers had to balance tactical considerations against disease prevention. Should they set up patrol bases near water sources, accepting higher mosquito exposure in exchange for access to water? Should they burn fires at night to help smoke away mosquitoes, knowing the smoke and light might reveal their position to enemy forces? Should they use insect netting in patrol bases, accepting reduced visibility and slower reaction times in exchange for protection from mosquito bites? These weren't hypothetical questions. Every day in the field required soldiers to make decisions that balanced immediate tactical threats against longer-term disease risks. The wrong choices could be fatal either immediately or eventually. The psychological burden of the mosquito threat was different from the snake threat, but no less real. While snake encounters were sudden and dramatic, the mosquito threat was constant and insidious. Every mosquito bite carried the possibility of infection. Every evening brought clouds of mosquitoes. There was no way to eliminate the threat, only to try to minimize it through prophylaxis that made you feel sick and might not work anyway. Australian soldiers came to hate the mosquitoes with a passion that veterans still express decades later. The constant whining, the itching from countless bites, the welts that covered every exposed patch of skin, the knowledge that each bite might be delivering parasites that would disable or kill you. The mosquitoes represented everything miserable about Vietnam, compressed into a tiny flying insect that you couldn't escape and couldn't defeat. The relentless parasites, leeches, and what they represented. The third wildlife threat we need to discuss appears in virtually every Australian Vietnam veteran's account of jungle operations. Leeches. These blood-sucking parasites were omnipresent in Vietnam's wet environments and came to symbolize the relentless, inescapable biological assault that soldiers faced throughout their deployments. Leeches themselves were not particularly dangerous in the immediate sense. A leech bite wasn't venomous or lethal, but the psychological impact of discovering these creatures attached to your body, gorged on your blood, and the physical consequences of repeated leech infestations created problems that went far beyond what the size of these parasites might suggest. Vietnamese jungles, rice paddies, and streams were inhabited by multiple species of leeches, both terrestrial and aquatic. The terrestrial leeches lived in leaf litter and vegetation, waiting for the vibrations and carbon dioxide signatures that indicated passing warm-blooded animals. When a potential host approached, the leeches would stretch toward it, attaching at first contact. Aquatic leeches inhabited the countless streams, rivers, and flooded rice paddies that Australian soldiers had to cross during operations. These leeches were often larger than their terrestrial cousins and could swim toward hosts with surprising speed when they detected vibrations in the water. Once attached, a leech would make a Y-shaped incision in the skin using its 3 jaws, each lined with tiny teeth. It would then secrete enzymes that prevented blood clotting and anesthetize the bite site so the victim wouldn't feel the feeding. The leech would gorge itself on blood, swelling to many times its original size over the course of minutes to hours. A single leech could consume several times its body weight in blood. For Australian soldiers, the leech experience began immediately when entering leech habitat. Veterans describe pulling dozens of leeches from their bodies during routine leech checks. The parasites would attach anywhere, to exposed skin, to areas under clothing, working their way into boots, and under equipment straps. Most disturbingly, they could enter body orifices, attaching inside ears, noses, and other areas where removal was difficult and dangerous. The tactical situation in Vietnam meant that Australian soldiers couldn't simply avoid leech habitat. The Puoc Tuy province, where Australian forces operated, included extensive areas of swamp, rice paddies, and jungle streams. Operations required moving through these areas, despite the certainty of leech infestation. There was no choice. The mission required entering leech territory. Australian patrol tactics emphasized slow, methodical movement through dense jungle, avoiding established trails. This meant pushing through heavy vegetation where terrestrial leeches waited in ambush. It meant crossing streams and wading through swamps where aquatic leeches lurked in dark water. The very tactics that made Australian forces so effective against human enemies maximized their exposure to parasitic ones. Leech checks became a regular ritual, as essential as weapons maintenance. Soldiers would examine themselves and each other, searching for the dark, swollen forms of engorged leeches or the smaller, thread-like shapes of leeches that had recently attached and not yet fed fully. Finding leeches was guaranteed. The question was never whether you had leeches, but how many and where they had attached. Removing leeches properly required care and knowledge. If you simply pulled a leech off, the head and mouth parts might remain embedded in the skin, leading to infection. The recommended removal methods included applying salt, burning with cigarettes, or using the heat from a lighter to encourage the leech to detach voluntarily. Some soldiers became skilled at removing leeches with knives, carefully cutting around the attachment point to ensure complete removal. The blood loss from leeches wasn't immediately dangerous to healthy soldiers. A single leech might consume 5 to 15 milliliters of blood, not enough to cause anemia or weakness. But soldiers weren't dealing with single leeches. They were dealing with dozens or even hundreds of leeches over the course of extended operations. The cumulative blood loss, combined with poor nutrition and other stresses, could contribute to fatigue and anemia. More significantly, leech bites bled extensively after the leech detached. The anticoagulant compounds the leech injected remained active in the wound, preventing normal clotting for hours. Veterans describe blood soaking through uniforms from multiple leech bites, creating visible stains and leaving trails. In tactical situations where avoiding detection was critical, this blood loss could create problems. Blood trails could be followed. Blood scent could be detected by tracking dogs. Leech bites were also prone to infection. The combination of the initial wound, the tropical environment, constant moisture, and poor field sanitation created ideal conditions for bacterial infection. What started as a small leech bite could develop into a larger wound that required medical attention. In some cases, particularly when leeches attached in sensitive areas or when infections spread, soldiers required evacuation for treatment. The psychological impact of leeches went beyond the physical effects. There was something viscerally revolting about discovering these creatures attached to your body, swollen with your blood. The knowledge that they'd been feeding on you while you were unaware created feelings of violation and helplessness. The creatures represented the environment itself, attacking you, feeding on you, slowly draining you. Veterans described the experience of pulling off boots at the end of a day's patrol to find leeches attached between toes, on the soles of feet, around ankles. The creatures would have been there for hours, protected by the boot from detection, feeding continuously. The psychological impact of this repeated violation took a toll that accumulated over tours lasting 12 months. The leech threat also interacted with other medical issues. Soldiers suffering from immersion foot and jungle rot, conditions we'll discuss in detail shortly, had wounds that attracted leeches. The open sores and damaged skin provided easy attachment points. The resulting combination of tissue damage, leech infestation, and infection created conditions that were difficult to treat in field settings. For Australian soldiers conducting extended patrols in remote areas, leech infestations added to the burden of supplies that had to be carried. Soldiers needed salt for leech removal. They needed cigarettes or lighters. They needed first aid supplies to treat the wounds leeches left behind. Every additional item required for leech management was weight that couldn't be used for ammunition, food, or water. The leeches also served as a constant reminder of the alien nature of the Vietnamese environment. These weren't creatures that existed in Australia in such numbers or variety. The sheer density of leech populations in Vietnamese jungle created an experience unlike anything Australian soldiers had encountered in their home country. This reinforced the feeling of being in a hostile environment where even the smallest creatures were threats. Some soldiers developed almost obsessive behaviors around leech prevention and removal. They would tape their pant legs to their boots, creating sealed barriers that leeches had to cross to reach skin. They would soak clothing in repellents, accepting the discomfort of chemical exposure rather than face more leeches. They would conduct leech checks every hour during operations in heavily infested areas, interrupting tactical movement to address the parasite threat. The command structure had to balance leech management against operational effectiveness. How much time could be allocated to leech checks? Should patrols avoid certain routes because of heavy leech infestation, even if those routes were tactically advantageous? When did leech infestation become severe enough to warrant evacuation? These weren't trivial questions. They had implications for mission success and soldier welfare. Medical personnel treating leech-related issues had to deal not only with the physical consequences, but also with the psychological impact. Some soldiers developed intense phobias of leeches, experiencing panic responses when they detected or imagined the creatures. These phobic responses could compromise operational effectiveness if severe enough, but the environment guaranteed continued exposure to the trigger. The leech experience became emblematic of the broader biological threat environment in Vietnam. Just as leeches were inescapable and relentless, so too were the other threats we're discussing. The environment itself seemed hostile to human presence, filled with creatures that existed to drain, poison, or infect anyone who entered their domain. For Australian soldiers specifically, the leech threat was intensified by their tactical methods. The slow, deliberate patrolling that made Australian forces so effective meant more time in leech habitat. The emphasis on moving through dense jungle rather than along trails meant more contact with leech-infested vegetation. The practice of establishing patrol bases in remote areas meant camping in locations where leeches were abundant. Veterans report that decades after leaving Vietnam, they still remember the leeches with visceral disgust. The memory of finding them attached, of removing them, of bleeding from multiple bites, of the constant vigilance required to detect them early. These memories persist with clarity that suggests genuine trauma. The leeches weren't just an inconvenience, they were a source of sustained psychological stress that contributed to the overall burden of service in Vietnam. The condition that made every step: agony, immersion, foot, and tropical disease. The fourth major wildlife-related threat Australian soldiers faced wasn't a specific creature, but rather a condition caused by constant exposure to the wet, tropical environment where countless microorganisms thrived. Immersion foot, called trench foot in previous wars, and often referred to as jungle rot in Vietnam, represented one of the most debilitating non-combat medical problems faced by troops operating in wet environments. Immersion foot occurs when feet remain wet and confined in boots for extended periods. The constant moisture and pressure cause small blood vessels in the feet to constrict, reducing blood flow to the tissue. Without adequate oxygen and nutrients from blood circulation, the skin and underlying tissue begin to break down. The damage starts as maceration, where the skin becomes soft, wrinkled, and pale from prolonged wetness. If exposure continues, the condition progresses to actual tissue death. For Australian soldiers in Vietnam, immersion foot was nearly inevitable during extended operations. The climate in Southeast Asia meant high temperatures and humidity. The monsoonal rains could dump 50 inches of rain during the wet season. Rice paddies, swamps, and jungle streams had to be crossed regularly. The tactical situation meant soldiers couldn't always stop to dry their feet or change socks. Australian forces operated extensively in wet environments. The Puak Tui province included areas of coastal lowland that flooded regularly. Operations in the Mekong Delta, where some Australian units deployed, involved constant wading through waterlogged terrain. Even in areas that seemed relatively dry, morning dew would soak soldiers' feet, and the humidity prevented boots and socks from drying throughout the day. The progression of immersion foot followed a predictable but terrible course. Initially, soldiers would experience tingling or itching in their feet. The skin would become wrinkled and pale, taking on a waterlogged appearance. If the exposure continued, the tingling would progress to numbness as nerve damage occurred. The feet would become red or bluish as blood flow became compromised. In advanced cases, the feet would begin to swell. The skin would start to peel off in sheets, revealing raw tissue underneath. Blisters would form and burst, creating open sores that provided entry points for infection. The flesh would literally begin to rot, producing a characteristic smell of decay that other soldiers could detect. According to military medical records from the Vietnam War, immersion foot could affect 35 to 50% of an infantry unit's combat strength after just 72 hours of continuous exposure to wet conditions. This statistic is staggering. It means that an Australian section of 8 to 10 men conducting operations in wet terrain could expect to lose 3 to 5 soldiers to foot problems within 3 days. The tactical implications of this attrition rate were severe. For Australian soldiers, the pain of immersion foot was described as intense and constant. Veterans report that putting boots on feet where the skin had begun to peel felt like walking on broken glass. Every step created agony as damaged tissue compressed against boot leather. But the mission couldn't stop. Patrols had to continue. Operations went forward. Soldiers walked on damaged feet because there was no alternative. The treatment for immersion foot was simple in theory, but nearly impossible to implement in field conditions. Keep the feet dry and clean. Allow air circulation. Avoid further pressure and trauma. None of these treatments were feasible for soldiers on active operations in the Vietnamese jungle. There was no way to keep feet dry when wading through rice paddies. There was no way to allow air circulation when hostile forces required constant readiness to move. There was no way to avoid pressure and trauma when carrying 60-pound packs over rough terrain. Medical personnel struggled to manage immersion foot cases. In mild cases, they would apply antifungal and antibacterial powders, encourage soldiers to change socks when possible, and hope that brief periods of dry conditions would allow some healing. In severe cases where skin had sloughed off and infection had set in, they had to make difficult decisions about whether to evacuate soldiers for treatment. Commanders were often reluctant to evacuate soldiers for immersion foot, viewing it as a preventable condition rather than a legitimate casualty. There was an undercurrent of judgment, the implication that proper foot care and discipline could prevent the condition. This attitude failed to account for the reality that in many tactical situations, proper foot care was literally impossible to maintain. The condition was exacerbated by the tropical environment's microbial load. Vietnam's heat and humidity created ideal conditions for bacterial and fungal growth. Every cut, every abrasion, every area of damaged skin became infected rapidly. The combination of immersion foot's tissue damage and the tropical disease environment created a perfect storm for severe infections. Tropical ulcers often developed from immersion foot wounds. These ulcers were crater-like lesions that ate through skin and tissue, sometimes exposing bone. The ulcers were extremely painful, produced foul-smelling discharge, and were notoriously difficult to treat. Veterans describe watching small wounds transform into ulcers the size of silver dollars that wouldn't heal despite treatment. The bacteria and fungi that caused these infections thrived in the exact conditions that characterized the Vietnamese environment. High heat, high humidity, poor sanitation, and constant moisture combined to create what medical personnel called a perfect growth medium for pathogenic organisms. Pseudomonas bacteria, Staphylococcus aureus, various fungal species, all found ideal conditions in the feet of soldiers operating in wet environments. Australian medical doctrine emphasized foot care as a command responsibility. Unit leaders were expected to enforce regular foot inspections, ensure soldiers changed socks when possible, and take action to prevent immersion foot before it became severe. But the reality of operations often made these preventive measures impossible to implement consistently. During extended patrols in remote areas, Australian soldiers couldn't carry enough spare socks to change them regularly. Socks that got wet stayed wet, because there was no opportunity to dry them in the humid jungle environment. Even if socks could be dried, they would be soaked again within hours of resuming movement through wet terrain. The boot design used by Australian forces in Vietnam was inadequate for the conditions. The standard issue boot was designed for temperate climates, not tropical wetlands. The leather didn't breathe well in high humidity. The design didn't include drainage ports that might have allowed water to escape. Soldiers' feet essentially spent their entire tours in sealed containers of moisture. Some soldiers tried to mitigate the problem by cutting drainage holes in their boots or wearing captured enemy sandals during periods in base camps. But these modifications came with their own problems. Holes in boots could allow leeches and other creatures to enter more easily. Sandals provided no protection during movement through rough terrain or when carrying heavy loads. The cumulative effect of immersion foot over a 12-month tour was severe. Many Australian Vietnam veterans returned home with permanent foot damage. Some lost toes to the combination of tissue death and infection. Others developed chronic foot problems, including reduced sensation, poor circulation, and susceptibility to reinfection that persisted for the rest of their lives. The psychological impact of immersion foot was as significant as the physical damage. Veterans described the demoralization of watching their feet deteriorate, of knowing that the condition would only worsen as long as operations continued, of being unable to prevent the damage despite their best efforts. The feet that had to carry them through hostile territory were literally rotting away, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Immersion foot also interacted with the other threats we've discussed. Leeches were attracted to the open sores and damaged tissue. Snakes were more likely to strike at soldiers whose impaired foot sensation meant they couldn't feel or react quickly to the vibration of approaching danger. Mosquitoes could land and feed on damaged feet without the soldier feeling it through the numbness. The condition created a cascading series of problems. Damaged feet made movement more difficult and painful, which slowed patrols and increased time in hostile territory. Slower movement meant more time with feet remaining wet, which worsened the condition. Soldiers with severe immersion foot couldn't move quietly because the pain made them adjust their gait, creating noise that could compromise tactical operations. For Australian forces specifically, immersion foot represented a significant tactical concern. The small unit sizes meant that the loss of even one soldier to medical evacuation for foot problems had outsized impacts. The emphasis on extended patrols meant Australian troops spent more consecutive days in field conditions than some other Allied forces, increasing their exposure to the conditions that caused immersion foot. The Australian military medical establishment studied immersion foot extensively during and after the Vietnam War. The condition was recognized as one of the primary non-combat causes of casualty and a significant threat to operational effectiveness. Various interventions were attempted, including improved boot designs, better foot powder formulations, and enhanced command emphasis on foot care. But ultimately, the nature of operations in Vietnam meant that immersion foot would remain a problem as long as soldiers had to operate in wet environments for extended periods. The condition was a direct result of the clash between the requirements of jungle warfare and the biological limitations of human feet enclosed in boots for days or weeks without adequate drying. Veterans report that the memory of immersion foot remains vivid decades later. The pain, the smell of rotting flesh, the sight of skin peeling from feet in sheets, the knowledge that the condition would worsen before it improved, all create lasting impressions. For many Australian Vietnam veterans, immersion foot and jungle rot symbolize the broader experience of environmental assault that characterized their service. The largest threat: centipedes, scorpions, and spiders. The fifth category of dangerous wildlife that Australian soldiers faced included the numerous arthropods that inhabited Vietnam's tropical environment. Giant centipedes, scorpions, and large spiders created another layer of threat that, while not typically fatal, caused intense pain, potential medical complications, and significant psychological distress. Vietnamese centipedes could reach remarkable sizes, with some specimens growing over 12 inches in length. These weren't the small centipedes soldiers might have encountered in Australia. These were massive predatory arthropods with powerful venom and aggressive temperaments. The giant Scolopendra species found in Southeast Asia were among the largest and most dangerous centipedes in the world. These centipedes possessed modified front legs called forcipules that functioned as venom delivery devices. When hunting prey or defending themselves, centipedes would grasp their target with these forcipules and inject venom through pore-like structures. The venom contained numerous compounds, including serotonin, histamine, and various proteins designed to immobilize prey and begin the digestive process. For humans, A centipede bite created immediate, intense pain that veterans consistently describe as worse than many combat injuries. The pain would radiate from the bite site, accompanied by rapid swelling that could encompass an entire limb. The affected area would become red, hot, and extraordinarily tender to any touch. Australian soldiers encountered centipedes in every conceivable location. The creatures would hide in boots left overnight, curl up in sleeping bags, conceal themselves in clothing, and lurk in the dark corners of bunkers and buildings. They were attracted to the warmth and shelter that military equipment and structures provided. Veterans described the morning ritual of shaking out every piece of equipment before use, knowing that a centipede hiding in a boot could deliver a bite that would incapacitate them for hours or days. The pain from centipede bites was so severe that medics would sometimes administer morphine to victims, treating the bite as seriously as a combat wound from the pain management perspective. The bites themselves rarely caused lasting physical damage, but the immediate impact could be operationally significant. A soldier bitten by a centipede on a hand or arm would have that limb swollen and useless for days. If bitten on a foot, walking became difficult or impossible until the swelling subsided. During critical operations, a single centipede bite could effectively remove a soldier from combat for days. Beyond the physical pain, centipede encounters created psychological trauma. There was something fundamentally disturbing about these creatures. Their segmented bodies, their numerous legs moving in undulating waves, their aggressive behavior when cornered, all combined to create a visceral response of revulsion and fear that went beyond rational assessment of the actual danger. Australian soldiers also had to contend with various scorpion species found throughout Vietnam. While Vietnamese scorpions were generally not as lethal as some species found in other parts of the world, their stings were intensely painful and could cause serious complications. Scorpions would hide in dark, confined spaces, exactly the sorts of places where soldiers would reach without looking: inside boots, under equipment, in the seams of tents, beneath rocks and logs that soldiers might use for cover or seating. The scorpion's defensive instinct was to sting anything that disturbed them, and their ability to strike quickly made avoiding stings difficult even when soldiers were cautious. The venom from scorpion stings caused immediate burning pain at the site, followed by numbness or tingling that could spread beyond the sting location. Swelling, redness, and extreme sensitivity to touch characterized the local reaction. In some cases, especially with stings from larger scorpions or multiple stings, systemic effects could occur, including difficulty breathing, muscle twitching, elevated blood pressure, and rapid heart rate. For Australian forces operating in remote locations, scorpion stings created medical challenges similar to those posed by centipede bites. The pain required management, the swelling could temporarily disable limbs, and the potential for serious complications meant medics had to monitor victims carefully. Evacuation for scorpion stings was rare, but sometimes necessary if systemic reactions occurred. Large spiders added another dimension to the arthropod threat. Vietnam was home to numerous large spider species, including various tarantulas and huntsman spiders that could reach hand-sized proportions. While most of these spiders were not dangerously venomous to humans, their size and sudden appearance created fear responses, and their bites could cause painful local reactions and infections. The psychological impact of encounters with large spiders was significant. Australian soldiers would discover these creatures on their equipment, on the walls of their quarters, or dropping from vegetation onto their heads and shoulders during jungle operations. The sudden appearance of a hand-sized spider created an instinctive panic response that could compromise tactical discipline. Some spider species found in Vietnam did possess medically significant venom. Various members of the widow spider family could deliver neurotoxic venom that caused systemic effects, including muscle cramps, abdominal pain, and respiratory difficulty. While deaths from spider bites were rare, the potential for serious medical complications meant that spider encounters had to be taken seriously. What made the arthropod threat particularly insidious was its intersection with the need for constant vigilance against other threats. Soldiers already had to maintain awareness of enemy forces, booby traps, and the numerous other dangers we've discussed, adding the requirement to check every piece of equipment, every dark space, every boot and bag for potentially painful or dangerous creatures added another layer of mental burden. The centipedes, scorpions, and spiders also served as vectors for the enemy's psychological warfare efforts. Viet Cong forces were known to deliberately place dangerous creatures in areas where they knew Australian or American troops would be. Scorpions positioned in water sources, centipedes hidden near trails, large spiders placed in likely patrol rest areas, all became weapons in the broader campaign to make the environment itself hostile to foreign forces. Australian soldiers developed elaborate checking rituals to protect themselves from arthropod encounters. Before sleeping, they would examine their sleeping areas thoroughly, searching for any creatures that might have taken up residence. Before dressing, they would shake out every piece of clothing and check every pocket and fold. Before eating, they would inspect their ration packs and mess equipment. These rituals became so ingrained that many veterans report continuing them decades after leaving Vietnam. The constant threat of painful arthropod encounters contributed to the overall stress of service in Vietnam. Even in supposedly safe rear areas, even when not facing direct enemy threat, soldiers couldn't relax. The creature that could deliver hours of intense pain might be hiding in your boot, under your bunk, inside your pack. There was no safe space, no location where vigilance could be dropped. Medical personnel treating arthropod envenomations faced challenges related to the remote locations and limited resources available in field conditions. Pain management was difficult when morphine supplies were limited and had to be preserved for combat casualties. Monitoring for systemic reactions required time and attention that might be needed elsewhere. Prevention through education about checking procedures and proper equipment storage became a significant part of medical duties. The arthropod threat also had implications for sleep and rest. Soldiers who needed sleep to maintain combat effectiveness couldn't achieve truly restful sleep when they knew that dangerous creatures might be sharing their sleeping quarters. The light, anxious sleep that resulted contributed to the chronic exhaustion that characterized extended operations. For Australian forces, the arthropod encounters represented another way in which the Vietnamese environment seemed fundamentally hostile to human presence. These creatures weren't unique to Vietnam. Similar species existed in parts of Australia. But the density and frequency of encounters in Vietnam created a qualitatively different experience. It wasn't a matter of occasionally seeing a large centipede or scorpion. It was a matter of encountering them daily, of having them invade your personal space constantly, of knowing that any moment of inattention might result in a painful sting or bite. The cumulative psychological effect of constant exposure to these creatures, combined with all the other threats, created a state of hypervigilance that took an enormous toll. Veterans describe feeling that they could never let their guard down, that every moment required alertness to multiple threats, that the environment itself was constantly trying to hurt them through dozens of different vectors. The psychological weight and legacy. What connects all 5 wildlife threats we've discussed in detail is a common theme that made the Australian experience in Vietnam uniquely challenging. The absence of sanctuary, the omnipresence of biological threats. Unlike conventional warfare, where there might be relatively safe rear areas or periods of reduced threat, the wildlife dangers in Vietnam were constant and inescapable. You could be killed or injured by venomous snakes, whether you were on patrol deep in hostile territory or using the latrine at a major base. You could contract malaria regardless of your tactical situation. Leeches would infest you anywhere there was moisture. Your feet would rot if you operated in wet conditions for extended periods, regardless of how careful you were. Centipedes and scorpions could deliver painful stings, whether you were in combat or trying to rest. This constant biological assault created a unique form of stress that distinguished Vietnam from previous conflicts where Australian forces had deployed. The psychological burden of knowing that you faced threats from every direction, at every moment, from sources you often couldn't see until they struck. This burden accumulated over 12-month tours into trauma that many veterans carried for the rest of their lives. Australian tactical doctrine emphasized slow, methodical operations conducted by small units operating with significant independence. These tactics proved extraordinarily effective against human enemies, but they also maximized exposure to biological threats. The extended patrols in remote areas meant more time in snake habitat, more exposure to disease-carrying mosquitoes, longer periods with wet feet developing immersion foot, and increased encounters with leeches and arthropods. The Australian forces in Vietnam developed a reputation for tactical excellence and operational effectiveness. But this effectiveness came at a cost measured not just in combat casualties, but in the accumulated toll of biological warfare against an environment that seemed designed to kill or incapacitate anyone who entered it. According to Australian military medical records, non-battle injuries and diseases accounted for a significant portion of all casualties in Vietnam. While exact figures vary depending on how casualties are counted and classified, estimates suggest that for every Australian soldier wounded in combat, several more required medical treatment or evacuation due to environmental factors, including the wildlife threats we've discussed. The malaria statistics alone illustrate the scale of the biological threat. Despite aggressive prophylaxis programs and command emphasis on prevention, thousands of Australian service members contracted malaria during their Vietnam tours. The disease incapacitated more soldiers than many major combat operations, yet it rarely appears in historical accounts that focus on battles and tactical actions. The psychological legacy of these wildlife threats persists among Australian Vietnam veterans. Studies of post-traumatic stress disorder among veterans consistently find that environmental stressors, including wildlife encounters, contributed to long-term psychological problems. Veterans report ongoing anxiety responses to situations that remind them of Vietnam, including encounters with snakes or insects in Australia decades after their service. Some veterans developed specific phobias related to their Vietnam experiences. Ophidiophobia, the fear of snakes, appears at elevated rates among Vietnam veterans who had traumatic snake encounters. Similarly, entomophobia, the fear of insects, sometimes develops in response to the constant exposure to leeches, centipedes, and other creatures in Vietnam. The physical legacy is equally significant. Veterans who contracted malaria sometimes experience recurrent infections throughout their lives as dormant parasites reactivate. Veterans who suffered severe immersion would often deal with chronic foot problems, including reduced sensation, poor circulation, and increased susceptibility to infection. These physical reminders keep the Vietnam experience present decades after the war ended. Australian society's understanding of the Vietnam veteran experience has often focused on combat trauma and the controversial nature of the war itself. But veterans themselves consistently emphasize that the environmental and biological threats were as psychologically damaging as the combat experience. The constant, inescapable nature of these threats created a form of stress that proved remarkably resistant to recovery. The Australian military learned significant lessons from the wildlife threat experience in Vietnam. Medical doctrine evolved to place greater emphasis on environmental disease prevention. Equipment design improved to better address the challenges of tropical operations. Training programs began incorporating more realistic preparation for the biological threats soldiers would face in tropical environments. But for the men who served in Vietnam between 1962 and 1972, these later improvements came too late. They faced the wildlife threats with inadequate preparation, insufficient equipment, and limited understanding of the long-term psychological consequences of sustained exposure to multiple environmental dangers. Understanding these wildlife threats helps us understand the complete picture of what Australian soldiers experienced in Vietnam. It's not enough to study the battles, the tactics, and the strategic situation. The daily reality of living under constant biological assault from snakes, disease, parasites, environmental conditions, and arthropods. This reality shaped the experience as fundamentally as any combat action. The Australian soldiers who served in Vietnam demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of these threats. They adapted to conditions that would seem intolerable to those unfamiliar with military service in tropical environments. They developed coping mechanisms, maintained their tactical effectiveness, and accomplished their missions despite the constant biological warfare they endured. But that resilience came at a cost that many veterans are still paying decades later. The hypervigilance necessary to survive in Vietnam became ingrained to the point where many veterans report never being able to fully relax, even in safe environments. The constant scanning for threats, the obsessive checking of equipment and clothing, the anxiety responses to insects or snakes, these behaviors persist long after the actual threat has passed. If you're an Australian Vietnam veteran watching this, thank you for your service and your sacrifice. The biological warfare you endured was as real and as dangerous as the combat you faced. The fact that these threats don't make headlines or appear in history books doesn't diminish their significance or their impact on your life. For everyone else, understanding these wildlife threats is crucial to understanding the full reality of the Vietnam War. The young Australian soldiers who deployed to Southeast Asia faced an environment that seemed designed to kill them through dozens of different biological vectors. They survived through vigilance, discipline, and extraordinary resilience, but they paid a price that extends far beyond the official casualty statistics. The snakes that could kill with a single bite, the mosquitoes that carried diseases that could disable or kill, the leeches that fed on blood and violated bodily integrity, the environmental conditions that caused feet to literally rot away, the centipedes and scorpions that delivered pain severe enough to require morphine. All of these threats were real, constant, and inescapable. Together, These 5 categories of wildlife threats created an environment where Australian soldiers could never feel truly safe. The jungle itself was hostile. The creatures within it were threats. The very conditions necessary for operations caused physical damage that accumulated over 12-month tours. This biological dimension of the war deserves recognition alongside the more widely known combat aspects. The Australian experience in Vietnam was shaped by tactical excellence, operational independence, and proven jungle warfare skills. But it was also shaped by snakes, malaria, leeches, immersion foot, and arthropods. The complete story includes both dimensions, and understanding both is essential to honoring the service of the men who lived through it. Thank you for watching this examination of the dangerous wildlife that Australian soldiers faced in Vietnam. If you found this informative and want to better understand the complete veteran experience, please share this video, like and subscribe for more content that goes beyond simplified narratives to explore the full reality of historical conflicts. Remember what was asked of these soldiers, and remember that the biological warfare they endured was as real as any other aspect of their service.